Hello, and welcome to this lecture entitled Science, Faith, Philosophy, the Moral Life in the Gilded Age. A cult of science developed after the Civil War, brought on in large part by the philosophy called Positivism. The chief theorist of Positivism was Auguste Comte, and it brought together Enlightenment ideas of order and progress. We can trace Positivism's roots back to Newton's scientific method and Descartes' duality of mind and matter. Positivism emphasized that valid knowledge came only through sensory inputs evaluated by the human intellect. It's a hyper-scientific method that replaced metaphysics in the search for truth and left little room for things like religious belief. Positivism opened the door for reliance on technical solutions to all problems, a faith in science, evolution as a model for change, and development of professional, specialized knowledge elites. Evolution itself played into this cult of science, beginning with Darwin's Origin of Species, published in 1859, and even the reaction of young earthers to Darwin's Origin of Species. This led to a worldview that replaced Newton's mechanistic physics with evolutionary biology as a metaphor to explain how everything worked. Eventually, this was politicized as social Darwinism and a little bit later as eugenics. A third component of this cult of science was the remarkable germ theory of disease. It was popularized first by Louis Pasteur in 1860 to 64, and it was stated as a theory and named by the German Robert Koch in 1876 when he proved that anthrax was caused by a bacteria. Let's look now at a slide concerning positivism and science. Comte's picture is to the far left. Next in, of course, is Darwin, then Koch, and finally Pasteur on the far right. This cult of science led to a cult of technology. And technology being, of course, the application of scientific principles in engineering mechanisms. This was driven by and drove industrialism. Now, there had been multiple industrial exhibitions across the Western world that both promoted and were part of this cult of technology, the most significant of which was the World Columbian Exposition, which we call the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. This was, as one person said, a blueprint for life in America, and it exposed American culture, especially technology. It was also an attempt to define Americanism in the face of rapid and unsettling change. The Chicago World's Fair lasted from May 1st until October 31st, 1893, and saw 27 million visitors at a cost of $28 million. It promoted modern technology all the way from motive power to electric lights to the vertical file that we use in our file cabinets today. Another promoter of this cult of technology were lay magazines like Popular Science in 1872, National Geographic in 1888, and even the Ladies' Home Journal of 1886 and Good Housekeeping that began in 1885. It seems counterintuitive that ladies' journals would promote a cult of technology, but indeed this was an era in which housekeeping was being seen in the absence of servants as something that technology and the scientific method could be applied to lessen the burden. This included everything from the creation of appliances that reduced the amount of work necessary to maintain the household. Of course, standards of cleanliness went up, and so the amount of work necessary to meet the standard was always about the same, all the way to scientific kits and training for chemically analyzing food products for adulteration. Remember, this was the era before there was a Food and Drug Act. So many times foods had chemical adulterations in them, chemicals added to them that may have enhanced their properties, but were bad for human health. Let's look at a couple of slides from the Chicago World's Fair. On the far left of this one, you can see a map of the fair against Lake Michigan. You see a couple of the pavilions in the center and to the right. You can see an aerial view from on high, the pond, and one of the main attractions, which was this giant 264-foot Ferris wheel that was a technological wonder of the age. The Eiffel Tower had been erected a little bit earlier for another World's Fair, and it was the mechanical wonder of the age, technological wonder of the age at that point, and so the Americans outdid it with Thomas Ferris's wheel. This, of course, spread like wildfire to every amusement park in the United States. Philosophies developed that attempted to promote or refute industrialization. Social Darwinism is a conservative philosophy that adopts Englishman Herbert Spencer's philosophy that, according to Richard Hofstadter in Social Darwinism in American Thought, is, quote, a reassuring theory of progress based upon biology and physics broad enough to satisfy agnostics and theists and satisfy the desire of advanced thinkers for a world system to replace the shattered Mosaic cosmology, unquote. That is, Spencer joined biology and physics into a single large worldview that explained everything from protozoa to politics. Spencer made a bow to theology with his unknowable category that made his theory palatable to Americans. His ideas were about change in society via evolution rather than mechanistic change. He accepted Lamarck's notion of acquired characteristics being passable to future generations. This had been disproven and discredited by Linnaeus and by Darwin himself. Social Darwinism says that ethical progress came from the adaptation of human character to the conditions of life, according again to Hofstadter. It rejected state intervention on behalf of the weak. The unfit were expendable. That is, survival of the fittest was the order of the day. It rejected any state support on behalf of social welfare. There was to be no public education, no sanitary laws, no housing regulations, no medical licensing. Social Darwinism rejected Bentham's utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number, in favor of unrestricted laissez-faire as the greatest good and the most moral life you could lead. There were indeed American disciples of Spencer, the most famous of which was Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie befriended and supported financially Spencer and replaced his own lost Christianity with Spencer's philosophy, replacing his dour capitalism with the motto, all is well since all grows better. He promoted this idea in his essay Wealth, published in the North American Review in 1889, in which Carnegie argued that disparities of income was a more ideal social system than equality of income, at least in former times, because it was the product of greater productivity in the economy. The poor brought poverty upon themselves by not being very productive. But then he also said that great wealth should not pass to descendants. It should be dispersed as philanthropy. Another extremely well-known and probably the most prominent intellectual backer of social Darwinism was William Graham Sumner, born 1840, died 1910, a professor at Yale, and his social Darwinism blended the Protestant ethic of frugality, temperance, industriousness with the classical economics, especially the fatalism of Malthus and Ricardo. He blended both of those with scientism and the positivism of evolutionary biology. Sumner believed that social evolution was a relentless natural law that invalidated the American ideals of equality of natural rights. He believed that American capitalists of the Gilded Age were the apogee of natural selection and the rigorous law of competition. He viewed democracy as sentimental foolishness, and socialists like Upton Sinclair, he thought, were puny meddlers and social quacks. Also, he was anti-imperialist and anti-tariff. Now, there were critics of this conservative philosophy. The first was Lester Frank Ward, who published his book Sociology in various editions from 1883 to 1906 that was an attack on social Darwinism's monism that animals and social evolution were just alike. But he proposed that there was actually a dualism that said animal evolution was different from social evolution. Animal evolution, according to Ward, was random and deterministic, whereas social evolution or social change was both purposeful and subject to human intervention. He had a long career as a civil servant. He called for government compiling of data as a basis for scientific lawmaking. He wrote many papers calling for positive government intervention in the economy and against outmoded natural law doctrines like social Darwinism. He believed that socially supported education, that is public schools, elevated the masses, whereas social Darwinism believed that public schools leveled the better classes. Another critic of social Darwinism was the school of thought called social gospel that blended Christian, that is Protestant activism in the Gilded Age and progressive era society with a crusade for justice and righteousness in all areas of the common life. This was a response to the rise of industry and the rise of the city. It was a response to squalor and poverty in those cities and the experience thereof by middle class and upper class people who applied what they thought of as Christian principles to ameliorate suffering. They replaced the concept of individual salvation with social activism as an example of the immanence of God on earth. Let me say that again. The immanence of God on earth was not individual salvation to them, but social activism. There were proponents of this. Walter Rauschenbusch, 1861 to 1918, was a Baptist minister who created an organization called the Brotherhood of the Kingdom to implement social change after 1892. Another theorist and practitioner of the social gospel, exemplar of the social gospel, was a guy named Washington Gladden, born 1836, lived till 1918, a congregational minister and a charter member of the American Economic Association. He was a city councilman in Columbus, Ohio from 1900 to 1902, a very short period of time, but in that period of time, coupled with his writings and speech making, he was able to attempt to implement some of the ideas of the social gospel in social activism done at the city level. Another of these fellows was Samuel M. Golden Rule Jones, born 1846, lived till 1904, a Welsh immigrant, worked with the Ohio Oil Company. Then he made oil industry equipment. He paid decent wages and treated workers well, which was outside of the social norm and certainly outside of the concepts of social Darwinism. And he was mayor of Toledo, Ohio from 1897 until 1904, where he opened free kindergartens, built free parks, and established the 8-hour workday for city workers. These are things we take for granted nowadays, but were a bone of contention in the late Gilded Age. Let's look at some of these social Darwinists. Here you see William Graham Sumner to the far left and Herbert Spencer in the middle. And then to the lower right is not a social Darwinist, but Lester Frank Ward, the enemy of social Darwinism. Social Gospelers included Washington Gladden, Walter Rauschenbusch, and Samuel Golden Rule Jones. Let's talk now about another aspect of this battle between social Darwinism and the social gospel in charity, settlement houses, and social work. This was part of a larger movement to reform the squalidness of the cities and provide access to public policy making for women. There were two versions of charity and settlement house and social work that worked on two different philosophies. The first of these, and the oldest, is the COS, the Charity Organization Society, that spread to the U.S. from Germany in 1877. Now, prior to the COS, public welfare had been delivered by political machines that exchanged the dole and public jobs for votes. The COS considered itself superior to public welfare because it distributed charity outside of the political system. It considered the cause of poverty to be personal failings, so the COS's aim was to reform the recipient's moral character and instill self-sufficiency. It divided the poor into the worthy poor and the unworthy poor. And among its members, women visitors, quote unquote, called on potential charity recipients, but in the spirit of the times began to use scientific observation and recording techniques that gave rise to the casework model later used by social workers. Another part of this movement was the settlement house movement. University Settlement House was the first one, opening in 1886 in Chicago, but the most famous was Hull House, opened by Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr in 1889. By 1913, the U.S. had over 400 settlement houses in cities across the U.S., and by 1900 had almost 500. Settlement house workers considered poverty to be caused by social and economic inequality, as well as overly fast recruitment of immigrants to work in the United States. They wanted the rich and the poor to live in greater harmony, and they tried to Americanize immigrants through education and supervised recreation. That is, settlement house workers wanted to avoid recreating the fierce economic class struggle of Europe, so its strategy was to give its charges the skills to advance in U.S. society. Let's look now at settlement house workers. On the left is Jane Addams, about 1895. In the center is Hull House, that most famous of American settlement houses. And on the right is Ellen Starr in approximately 1914. Now, in summary, science and technology advanced not only in itself, but also as a promise for better individual life and as the basis for ethical philosophy. In the context of industrialism and unrestricted capitalism, an enchantment with science and technology led some thinkers to construct social theories that justified the Gilded Age status quo, but led others to construct social theories that challenged it. Even within the Reform community, opinions about emerging questions of how a rapidly changing society could provide for its members differed markedly. This, then, is the end of the lecture, and as always, thanks for your attention.